Hey everybody! For today's Jolly Lark, we're going to be showing you some tips and techniques for painting multicolored cloth, motley outfits a little faster and easier. We're going to do that with the new dandelion miniature from our friends at Monster Fight Club. And in this video, you should be able to hopefully take away some new ideas that make painting this sort of multicolored fabric outfits a little less intimidating. These three Vallejo game color colors are going to be the basic palette for getting started on the miniature. These are all, particularly the blue and the pink, are a little bit lighter than I'm intending the final colors to be. And that's intentional, because what we're going to do is base coat the whole model in a little bit paler, lighter version of what we want the final model to look like. And then we're going to use washes, kind of a universal shading wash, to darken all the colors simultaneously. And what becomes really challenging about multicolored outpainting, multicolored outfits like this, is individually highlighting and shading all the different colors. So we're going to try to basically skip that step and use a little trick to make it so that we can end up with a miniature that we're happy with without going through all the tedious steps of necessarily individually highlighting and shading every last part with three different colors. The other thing you can do when painting a multicolored outfit like this, we'll just call it motley from now on, is to be aware of what colors cover what other colors. Starting with a white primer here over a black undercoat, and I'm starting with this kind of orangey yellow because I know the other colors are going to cover it pretty well. So the magenta purpley color, that's the one that kind of intersects with the yellow. So while we let the yellow dry, we can switch over to the blue color. And again, this is almost more like base coating with your highlight color here. If the traditional way of shade, highlight, base coat is that you would base coat and then you shade and then you highlight. But in this instance, really what we're doing here is almost putting the highlight on as the base coat, and then we're just going to darken it from there and not worry too much about going in and painting highlights, because that's the harder part. The other thing you can be aware of as you're painting, again, with what colors cover what, going from kind of lighter to darker, kind of high opacity to lower opacity, and this just takes a little bit of practice with your paint to learn. But I know from experience that these blue paints here, the magenta is going to cover these okay. So while I'm base coating the blue areas, I'm not really worrying too much about hitting any areas that might be purple. But I am trying to be careful about not getting any blue on parts of the face or on the hands or on the white cuffs or the white neck kerchief. Because if I want those areas to be lighter later, the face and the white shirt, those would be a little bit harder to cover up later. So part of painting quickly is also knowing where it's okay to make mistakes so that you can work fast, and where are the parts where you need to slow down a little bit and be careful. Similarly, like on the leggings here, you just paint blue wherever. You're just trying to make sure all the leggings are blue. And I know that I'm going to be able to cover that blue up pretty easily with a brown down the road. Now, okay, let's slow this back down here because I've just made a mistake. I just realized that this miniature, which I haven't painted before, actually one of his stockings is falling down. So the upper part of his right leg shouldn't be blue, but it's going to be flesh toned later. So you can see what I've done here is just put down my brush that had paint on it, grab a bigger, fatter brush, get it wet in my rinse water, and I'm basically using that wet but not dripping big fat brush, almost like an eraser. Acrylic paint, it might look dry, it might even be dry to the touch for, in a minute, but it's actually workable usually for more like 5-10 minutes after you put it on. So it's relatively easy to remove a mistake if you catch it quickly. And I'm not worrying too much if there's a little hint of blue left on that area that's going to have skin tones, because most Caucasian skin tones do have some blue undertones. So if there's a little bit of blue left in the cracks and crevices of that part of his leg that's going to end up as skin, that's okay. So once you're done with the blue, time to move on to the purple. And we've already basically covered what we're doing with this. We're putting on a nice bright purple that's going to get darker. With the purple, since it is the last of the three colors to go on, it's good just to be careful, leave some of that yellow visible in the slashes on his pants. be careful about where the joins are in between the purple and the blue, but this kind of magenta-y, pinky color is going over the blue pretty well. And once the purple is all done, you've got the purple and all the purpley areas, it's time to move on and darken everything up. To darken this palette of colors, what I'm going to use here is a little bit of the Vallejo blue wash. It's kind of a nice medium neutral blue. Something like Citadel's Dracoff Nightshade, I think would be a little bit too dark blue, black blue. I think the new shade paint, Tyran Blue, could also work well for this. If you've got a collection of contrast paints on your painting table, I think any of the medium blues mixed down, probably 1-to-1, maybe even 2-to-1 with contrast medium, would work well too. You do want to still, the goal here is to be able to get a shade that's going to flow into the cracks and crevices, but still maintain that brighter color on top. When you're looking for a universal shade color of something that you can wash all over the miniature, blue is usually a pretty good starting point. There's some colors that blue doesn't work great on as a shade. You generally don't want to use blue to shade red because you'll end up with getting something that looks a little more purple to the eye. But in this case, that's actually what we're going for, and we're making use of that effect to shade this magenta with blue, and we're not going to end up with something that looks magenta. We're going to end up with something that looks more purple because it's going from this blue in the recesses up to the purple on the raised areas. Shading blue with blue, obviously no problem there. But one thing to note here is that I'm not putting blue all over everything. I'm avoiding putting blue shadows on his skin, and some contrast in the color of the shadows will provide a little more visual interest in the final model. If you just wash the entire miniature with the same shade, that works, but it can sometimes be a little less interesting. So we'll leave the skin areas alone, leave the blue off of them. We'll come back in with a flesh shade on those later. But the real trick here is that we're trying to make painting this multicolored motley a little easier, and using the same color shade for all of it does just that. And that leaves you with something like this. So now that the blue has darkened up, that darker blue shadows really change the tone of the blue, and the blue shading is the most dramatic on the purple, where it really changes the tone of the magenta paint into kind of a rich velvety purple. And once that's all dry, all I'm going to do is take that same medium blue, this is the Vallejo blue wash, and I'm just going to do it again. Doing it again will darken the darkest shadows a little further. Will darken everything, but it darkens all the colors a little bit, just increases the amount of shadows and shading you've got. And all I'm doing here is just putting the exact same blue wash all over all the same areas one more time. Easy to do once, not that much harder to do twice. And those deeper shadows will just kind of be a little bit more interesting. And you can see what I'm doing here is I'm not necessarily putting it all over, but I am going back in with a second coat and putting a little bit more of the blue shadow on any areas I want to be darker. This will help leave the parts that are the brightest right now, leave those bright, but get some deeper shadows and more contrast. Just as an example here on the leg, you're putting a little more shading on the lower half of the leg that's going to be further away from the sun, putting a little more of the blue underneath the kneecaps, underneath the calf, on the underside of the arm. So this isn't necessarily all over. It'd be a little bit more judicious, but because it's a thin wash, you still can go pretty quickly and don't have to be too fastidious about it. And with the second layer of blue shade done, now we've got something like this. You can look and see it's still pretty bright from up top, but has some nice dark shading in the cracks and recesses. You could stop there, but I do want to push the highlights a little bit further. I know I said earlier that we're not going to highlight every single individual color, and that's true. But I do want to put some just little spot highlights of a little bit brighter colors on the most raised, most prominent areas. The top of his hat, the top of his wrist, those sort of upwards facing prominent areas that just could use a little bit of a lighter touch. And all I'm doing here is taking some ivory, kind of a bone ivory color, and mixing a little bit of it in with that same palette that I had before. Keeping the palette pretty limited for this project. I'm only using, I think, 8 or 9 paints when it's all said and done. So just a little bit of brighter pink on some of the top facing edges, mostly just on the front of the miniature, just help make everything pop a little bit more. If this seems a little too detailed and fiddly, you certainly could skip this step, but as is often the case, bringing the highlights up just one step brighter is usually a good call. And even bringing them up again a little brighter than that can help further. But each time you're adding another layer of highlighting, it's usually quite a lot smaller than the previous layer. The pitfall that I sometimes see on miniatures is having, I don't know, the shade and the midtone and the highlight colors of painters thinking that they ought to be about the same size, and you end up with kind of big chunky highlights. You generally want your highlights to be just a little smaller, just little pinpricks of brightness that make the miniature pop. And I'm going to do the same thing with the blue here, taking the same ivory color, mixing it into the same starting blue color, just putting some little pop, little tiny pricks of light on the upper edges of his sleeves, on the very leading edge of the outside of that rolled stocking, but not much, a little bit of line down the side, but just little highlights. And to highlight the little bits of yellow in the outfit, the kind of bandolier necklace thing that Dandelion's wearing, and the yellow that's inside the purple slashes, I'm going to grab a little bit thinner liner brush here and use the original yellow color that we started with as the highlight color. So just dropping a tiny little bit of yellow onto the edges of those creases really makes them pop, and won't really need to highlight those individually again. So that's the single smallest, kind of thinnest detail, but is pretty evident in the finished miniature. So jumping forward a bit, I've painted the skin, kind of standard skin, flesh wash, highlight with the same base tone skin again. However you like to paint skin is fine, but I wanted to show you something I did with the base here. I gave it a quick gray coat all over, and I'm putting on the Vallejo Smoky ink. Any brown transparent paint like Contrast or Pro Acryl transparent paint would also work. Put a little bit of the brown transparent paint on there, and then gave it a big brush full of water to kind of spread it out and dilute it. And then I'm kind of moving it around a little bit to get an uneven wash of transparent brown, like so. We'll let that dry and give that a quick dry brush of the same gray that I used for the base coat. And that's a quick way to finish the base without actually adding any additional basing textures. So if you're new to my channel, welcome. I'm glad you're here. If you are not and you've seen some of my painting videos before, you know that I often like to finish a miniature by just putting the lightest dry brush of a ivory color all over most of the colored parts of the miniature. So with that here, and a pretty big fat dry brush because I don't want it going into the cracks, just the slightest hint of a dusting of ivory color on his raised hand, on his face, on the front part of his hat, and the front part of his right thigh, a little bit on the back, just can kind of adds again that depth that we're looking for, so that the range of brightnesses on the miniature is going from very bright all the way down to very dark. It's easy to overdo this. If you put too much on, it can look a little chalky or washed out. Just the tiniest bit, and stop when you think it looks good, and maybe even stop a few brush strokes before you think it looks good. That's probably enough, because it's better to underdo this step than to overdo it. And there you go, one rascally bard ready to hit the table. The painting handle I've been using throughout the video is the new Jolly Lark wooden painting handles that recently had a successful Kickstarter. Check out the description for a link to those. The miniatures by Monster Fight Club, thanks to them for that. You hear it all the time, but liking and subscribing to small channels really does help, so thank you for that. And we'll see you next time for another Jolly Lark.